My name was called before I was ready for it. Callum Doyle, report to the ring. I stood up so fast my knees cracked against the bench in front of me. Around the training hall, 40 recruits turned to look, and I felt every one of those eyes land on me like a weight. The ring in the center of the hall was just a raised platform with padded flooring, nothing special to look at, but right then it felt like the edge of a cliff. Commander Draven Solis stood beside it with his arms folded behind his back. He was Cathari, tall and narrow, with skin the color of wet stone and eyes that never seemed to blink long enough. His people had been soldiers for longer than humans had been building cities, and he looked at every recruit the same way, like he was already deciding how useful we would be in a fight that had not happened yet. "Get in the ring, Doyle," he said. "You are sparring Selk Norwin. Full contact, no mercy." He said those last two words, the way he said everything, flat and quiet, and half the recruits around me actually smiled. No mercy was a phrase Commander Solis used almost every day. It meant fight properly. It meant do not embarrass yourself by tapping out after one push. Nobody in that hall thought it meant anything more than that, including me. I climbed into the ring across from Selk, a broad recruit from a species called the Dren, built like a wall with a face, and for the next 4 minutes we did exactly what everyone always did during sparring. We circled. We traded a few strikes that never landed with any real force behind them. When his fist came close to my jaw, I let my head snap back a little early, and when I aimed a kick at his side, he shifted just enough for it to graze him instead of hit. Neither of us wanted to actually hurt the other, because in the coalition military, that was the unspoken rule everyone followed no matter what the commander shouted from the sidelines. "Enough," Solis said eventually, sounding unimpressed, and waved us both out of the ring. I sat back down next to Iris Calloway, another human recruit, who leaned over and muttered, "That looked more like a dance than a fight." "That is the point," I whispered back. "Nobody wants to break someone's arm in training." She laughed under her breath, and for a moment, the tension in the hall eased into something almost comfortable. That was how it had gone every single day since we arrived. The commander barked his usual line, we performed something that looked vaguely like combat, and everyone walked away with their pride mostly intact, and their bodies completely intact. It was a routine, and routines feel safe, right up until the moment they stop being true. "Vance, Nora," Solis called out. "Report to the ring." I hadn't paid much attention to her before that day. She was one of the newer human recruits, quieter than most of us, with short brown hair and a way of sitting perfectly still that made her easy to overlook in a room full of people who fidgeted constantly. She didn't talk much, didn't laugh at the jokes that went around the barracks, and when she walked like she was listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. There had been rumors about her within the first week. Someone said she came from a colony world out past the frontier line, one of the ones the official reports politely called a challenging environment, and everyone else just called a Deathworld. I hadn't put much thought into what that actually meant. I grew up on Meridian Station, a core world colony with climate control and predator-free parks, and to me, the word Deathworld was just a label, something that belonged in a briefing document, not a person sitting 3 seats down from me at breakfast. Nora stood up without any hesitation and walked to the ring like she was heading to get a glass of water. She was smaller than most of the recruits in the hall, lighter too, and when Solis paired her against Grath Balmore, a Dren recruit even larger than Selk, a ripple of quiet laughter moved through the crowd. Grath grinned as he stepped into the ring, showing teeth that had not evolved for smiling. "This will be short," he said, loud enough for half the hall to hear. Solis raised one hand between them. "Full contact," he said again, the same words he said every single day. "No mercy." I watched Nora's face as he said it. Everyone else in that hall had learned to hear those words as background noise, the same way you stop hearing a fan running in a room after enough time passes. But Nora's expression didn't change the way it should have if she'd been treating it as background noise. Her eyes sharpened, her shoulders dropped half an inch, settling into a stance that looked nothing like the loose, careless posture the rest of us used before a friendly match. It looked like something else entirely, something I didn't have a word for yet. I nudged Iris. "Look at her stance," I said. Iris shrugged. "Maybe she's just nervous." She didn't look nervous. She looked like someone getting ready to lift something heavy, gathering herself before the weight arrived. I had seen soldiers brace like that before drills that were expected to go wrong, not before a sparring match against a recruit twice her size in front of an audience that already assumed she would lose. Solis dropped his hand. "Begin." Grath moved first, the way big fighters always did, trusting his size to end things quickly. He stepped forward and threw a heavy strike aimed at her shoulder, the kind of blow that in every other match that day had been thrown at half speed and pulled just before contact, a formality more than an attack. Nora didn't step back. She didn't perform the little dance the rest of us performed. She moved into the strike instead of away from it, turning her body so it caught her on the arm instead of the shoulder, and I heard the sound of impact land differently than it had all day, sharp and real, instead of soft and staged. The hall went quiet. Grath staggered, more from surprise than pain, I think, because nobody expected contact like that in a training bout, and in that half-second of his hesitation, Nora closed the distance completely. What happened next took maybe 2 seconds, and I have replayed it in my memory more times than I can count since. She drove her weight low, hooked his leg out from under him with a motion that looked almost gentle, and was clearly not, and as he dropped, she used the momentum of his own fall to guide him down hard onto the mat. The sound of him hitting the padded floor was loud enough that I felt it in my chest. Grath lay there for a moment, stunned, one hand pressed to his ribs, and the entire training hall had gone completely silent. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody looked bored. Every recruit in that room was staring at the small human girl standing over a dren twice her size, breathing evenly, waiting to see if the match was actually over. Commander Solis stepped forward, and for the first time since I had arrived at this posting, I saw something on his face that wasn't the usual flat, unimpressed patience. It looked almost like interest. "Match ends," he said. "Vance wins." Grath pushed himself up slowly, wincing, and Nora offered him a hand without a trace of triumph on her face, like she had simply done the job that was asked of her, and nothing more. He took the hand, after a moment of visible surprise, hauled himself up, and limped out of the ring, rubbing his side. I turned to Iris, and she was staring at me with the same question written across her face that was forming in my own mind. "Did she just actually try to hurt him?" Iris whispered. I didn't answer right away, because I was still trying to understand what I had watched. In every match before hers, "no mercy" had been a phrase we all agreed to ignore, a tradition everyone respected because everyone benefited from it. Nora Vance had heard the exact same order the rest of us heard every single day, and instead of ignoring it, she had simply done what it said. Across the hall, Commander Solis was looking at her the way you look at a tool you didn't know you owned, one you were only now realizing might actually work the way it was designed to. "Vance," he said, "report to my office after training." She nodded once, calm as ever, and walked back to sit down beside the rest of us, like nothing unusual had happened at all. But something had changed in that hall, something I couldn't name yet, and as the next names were called for the next matches, I noticed that nobody was smiling the way they had before. Every recruit in that room was doing the same math I was doing, wondering what it actually meant that one of us had taken an order literally, and wondering what would happen the next time our own names were called. The office door was still closed when I walked past it that evening, and I could hear 2 voices inside, low and steady, neither one raised. I told myself I wasn't listening on purpose. I told myself I just happened to slow down while passing. That was a lie, and I knew it even as I stood there pretending to check something on my wrist display. "You fought like the order meant something," Commander Solis was saying. "It did mean something," Nora answered. "You said no mercy. I didn't see a reason to guess what you meant instead of what you said." I didn't wait to hear more. I walked on, before someone caught me standing there, but her words followed me the whole way back to the barracks. I didn't see a reason to guess what you meant instead of what you said. It sounded so simple when she said it, and yet nobody else in that hall, not one recruit out of 40, had ever thought to take the commander at his word. We had all decided, without ever discussing it, that no mercy was a phrase you were supposed to interpret rather than obey. The next morning, the training hall felt different before a single match had even started. Recruits who normally joked and stretched and complained about the early hour were quiet, glancing toward the ring like it might do something unexpected on its own. Grath sat near the back with a support wrap around his ribs, and when Commander Solis walked in, nobody smiled at his usual greeting. "Today we continue sparring evaluations," Solis announced. "Full contact. No mercy." The words landed differently now. I heard several recruits shift in their seats. "Doyle, Vance," he said, "you are paired together." My stomach dropped so fast I almost laughed out of nerves. Of all the recruits in that hall, I was being paired against the one person who had just proven she meant every word the commander said. Iris grabbed my arm before I stood, her grip tight. "You can ask to switch," she whispered. "Nobody would blame you." I actually considered it for half a second, and then I thought about how it would look, refusing a match against someone smaller than me in front of everyone who had just watched her win. Pride is a strange thing. It makes decisions for you sometimes before your better judgment gets a vote. "I'm fine," I said, and stood up before I could talk myself out of it. Walking to the ring felt longer than it had the day before. Nora was already there, standing with that same stillness I had noticed the first time I really looked at her, patient, unhurried, waiting without any of the restlessness the rest of us carried into every match. Up close, she didn't look intimidating in the way Grath did. She was maybe average height for a human woman, lean rather than heavily muscled, and if I had passed her on Meridian Station, I would never have looked twice. It was only when you watched her stand still that you noticed something was different, some quality in her stillness that made the air around her feel charged, the way the sky feels charged right before a storm, even when the clouds haven't gathered yet. "You don't have to hold back," she said quietly, just to me, before Solis called the start. "I'll know if you do, and it won't help either of us." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and a moment later, Solis's hand dropped, and the match began. I want to describe what happened next as clearly as I can, because I have gone over it in my memory so many times since that day that I'm afraid the details might have started to blur into something more dramatic than the truth. I will try to be honest about it. I threw the first strike, a simple jab aimed at her shoulder, faster than I had thrown at Selk the day before, because some part of me had already decided that going easy on her would be its own kind of insult after what I'd overheard. She didn't dodge it the way I expected. She stepped into it, the same way she had stepped into Grath's strike, redirecting the force along her arm instead of absorbing it straight on, and before I understood what had happened, my own momentum had been turned against me, and I was stumbling forward off balance. She could have ended it right there. I want to be clear about that, because it became important to me later, in a way I didn't expect. She had an opening wide enough to finish the match in that first exchange, and she didn't take it. Instead, she let me recover my footing, waited exactly as long as it took me to reset my stance, and only then came forward again. I threw 2 more strikes after that, both of them faster and harder than anything I'd used in training before, driven by a mix of fear and stubbornness that I am not particularly proud of admitting to now. Both times, she was already somewhere else by the time my fist arrived, not through speed alone, but through a kind of anticipation that felt almost unfair, like she was reading the shape of my next move in the half-second before I made it. The 4th exchange ended the match. She caught my wrist mid-strike, used my own forward motion to pull me off my feet, and guided me down onto the mat with enough control that I landed hard, but not dangerously, winded rather than injured, staring up at the ceiling of the training hall while my ears rang faintly from the impact. She knelt beside me for a moment, checking my eyes the way you check someone who might have hit their head. "You're fine," she said, more to herself than to me, confirming something rather than asking. Then she stood and offered her hand, the same gesture she had made toward Grath the day before, and I took it, because refusing would have felt smaller than losing had. "Match ends," Solis called out. "Vance wins." I sat up slowly, testing my own limbs, and found that aside from a dull ache in my shoulder and a bruise forming on my forearm, I was completely fine. That surprised me more than losing had. Every match I had ever fought against someone stronger or faster than me had ended with some kind of real damage, a split lip, a twisted joint, something to remember the loss by. This had ended with control so precise it felt almost gentle, despite how hard she had actually fought. I understand now, in a way I didn't understand that day, that this was the whole point of what she was doing, and the whole reason the commander's interest in her kept growing. She wasn't simply fighting without restraint. She was fighting with total honesty, giving every strike as much force as the moment actually called for, and no more than that. Against Grath, who had come at her with real intent to embarrass her in front of the hall, she had matched his intent completely. Against me, someone clearly nervous and mostly trying to save face, she had still fought with full commitment, but she had also made sure I walked away from it whole. Back on the bench, Iris was staring at me like I'd come back from somewhere unusual. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I'm fine," I said, and meant it, though my shoulder disagreed with a dull throb every time I lifted my arm. "What was it like?" she asked, quieter now, glancing toward Nora, who had already returned to her seat and was sitting with that same unreadable stillness as always. I thought about how to answer that honestly. It was like fighting someone who already knew exactly how the match would end before it started, I said finally, like she wasn't guessing what I would do, like she already knew. Over the following days, more matches followed, and I watched the pattern repeat itself across different opponents, different sizes, different species. Nora never lost. That alone would have been remarkable enough on its own, but what actually unsettled the recruits around her wasn't just that she won. It was how completely she committed to every single exchange, treating each match with the same seriousness a soldier might bring to an actual conflict, while the rest of us were still only beginning to understand that the phrase, "no mercy," might not have been a figure of speech after all. Selk Norwin, who had sparred against me on the first day, ended up facing her 3 days later, and their match lasted less than a minute before he tapped the mat twice, signaling submission before any real harm could come to him, having clearly decided that pride mattered less than avoiding what had happened to Grath's ribs. A young Cathari recruit named Petra Ashford, quick and light on her feet, tried to use speed alone to avoid Nora's reach entirely for the first 30 seconds of their match, circling and darting rather than engaging directly. It worked for a while, longer than anyone else had managed, until Nora simply adjusted her angle of pursuit, cutting off Petra's retreat path before she had fully committed to it, ending the match with the same calm efficiency as every match before it. By the end of that week, something had shifted in the entire training hall that went beyond just Nora's growing reputation. Recruits who had once treated sparring as a formality, a chance to look competent without any real risk attached, started training differently, even against each other. Strikes landed with a little more force than before. Defensive stances tightened. Nobody wanted to be caught the way Grath had been caught, careless and overconfident against an opponent they had underestimated. Commander Solis noticed the change too, and I began to suspect, watching him observe every match with that same sharp, unreadable attention, that this shift in the hall was exactly what he had been hoping for all along, even if none of us understood his reasons yet. He had been repeating the same order every single day for longer than any of us had served under him. No mercy, no mercy, no mercy, and only one recruit out of everyone in that hall had ever actually believed him. I found myself thinking about Nora Vance more often than I expected to, replaying that moment on the mat when she had checked my eyes to make sure I was all right, that small, careful gesture buried inside all that controlled intensity. It didn't fit the picture the rumors had painted of someone raised on a Deathworld, someone hardened past the point of caring about anyone else's well-being. If anything, it suggested the opposite, that she cared enormously about the difference between necessary force and needless harm, and had simply grown up somewhere that taught her exactly where that line sat, while the rest of us had grown up somewhere soft enough that we never had to learn it at all. That distinction would matter more than I understood at the time, and it would matter most of all when training stopped being training, and the line between practice and reality disappeared completely. The alarm for an unscheduled assembly went off 2 weeks after my match against Nora, and I remember the specific dread of that sound because unscheduled assemblies never meant anything good. Recruits filed into the main hall faster than usual, boots echoing against the metal floor, and I found Iris near the front, her face tight with the same uncertainty I felt. "What's happening?" I asked her. "I don't know," she said, "but Grath looks worse than I've ever seen him." She was right. Grath Balmore stood near the front of the assembly, arms crossed, jaw set in a way that told me whatever had happened, it had happened to him directly, and he was furious about it. His ribs had healed weeks ago, but something in his posture suggested a fresh wound, one that wasn't physical. Commander Solis walked in, flanked by 2 other officers I didn't recognize, and the room went silent immediately. He didn't waste time with introductions. "Recruit Balmore has filed a formal complaint," Solis said, his voice carrying easily across the hall without needing to be raised. "He claims that Recruit Vance's conduct during sparring exceeded reasonable limits and that her continued presence in training poses a risk to the unit." Every head in the room turned toward Nora, who sat exactly where she always sat, spine straight, hands resting on her knees, expression unreadable. She didn't look surprised, she didn't look defensive either. She simply waited, the same way she waited before every match, like she had already run through every possible outcome of this moment, and settled on patience as the correct response. Grath stepped forward without waiting to be invited to speak. "She broke 2 of my ribs during a training exercise," he said, and I could hear something underneath the anger in his voice, something that sounded almost like humiliation. "That is not training, that is an assault. You were ordered to fight without holding back," Solis said evenly. "Recruit Vance did exactly that." "Nobody else in this unit fights like that," Grath snapped back. "Nobody else treats a training order as an excuse to actually hurt people." I felt the air in the room shift as several recruits nodded along with him, quiet murmurs of agreement rippling through the crowd. I understood the impulse. It was easier to believe that Nora was the exception, some kind of anomaly whose behavior needed correcting, than to accept the much less comfortable idea that the rest of us had simply never followed our orders correctly in the first place. Solis let the murmuring continue for a moment before raising one hand, and the hall fell silent again immediately. "Recruit Vance," he said, "would you like to respond to this complaint?" Nora stood, unhurried as always, and turned to face the room rather than just the commander, which surprised me. I had expected her to keep her answer short and private, but instead she seemed to want everyone present to hear what she had to say. "I was told there would be no mercy," she said. "I believed that meant something. If it didn't, if the order was only ever meant to sound serious without actually being followed, then I would like to know that now, so I can adjust my conduct going forward." The hall stayed silent for a long moment. I watched Grath's expression shift from anger toward something closer to confusion, as if he hadn't expected her to answer so plainly, without excuses or apology. "Where I come from," Nora continued, her voice steady but not loud, "holding back in training gets people killed later, when the stakes are real and there's no one standing by to call an end to the match. I didn't hurt Recruit Balmore out of anger. I fought him with the same seriousness I would use anywhere else, because that is the only kind of fighting I know how to do honestly. If that seriousness is a problem for this unit, then I think the problem isn't with how I fight, it's with what this unit actually wants from an order like No Mercy." I watched Commander Solis's face carefully during her answer, and I saw something there that none of the other officers seemed to notice. A flicker of something that looked almost like satisfaction, quickly hidden behind his usual unreadable calm. "Recruit Balmore," he said, turning back to Grath. "Your complaint has been heard. However, I issued the order myself, and Recruit Vance followed it precisely as given. If there is fault here, it belongs to me for giving an order that this unit has apparently never taken seriously until now, not to the one recruit who did." Grath opened his mouth to argue further, then seemed to think better of it, glancing around at the rest of us, as if searching for support that wasn't coming anymore. The murmuring from earlier had quieted, and I realized that somewhere during Nora's answer, the mood in the room had shifted from sympathy for Grath toward something more uncertain, a collective recognition that maybe the fault really did belong to all of us equally, for treating an order as decoration rather than instruction. "This assembly is concluded," Solis said. "Training resumes as scheduled tomorrow. The order stands. No mercy." He said those two words with a weight I hadn't heard him use before, and I understood, watching him walk out of the hall, that something had been decided in that moment beyond just the outcome of Grath's complaint. The commander had been testing all of us this entire time, and only one recruit had passed. That evening, Iris and I found ourselves sitting outside the barracks longer than usual, neither of us quite ready to go back to our bunks. The stars above the training compound were unfamiliar to both of us, distant points of light belonging to a sky neither of our homeworlds had given us, and somehow that made the conversation easier, like we were talking in a space that belonged to nobody yet. "Do you think she's right?" Iris asked eventually. "About the rest of us never following the order properly. I thought about the 2 seconds it had taken her to end my own match, and the moment she had checked my eyes afterward to make sure I hadn't hit my head too hard. I think she's right, that we were all guessing at what the commander meant," I said, instead of just doing what he said. "That's a strange way to grow up," Iris said quietly, "believing that holding back gets people killed." I didn't have an answer for that, not then, but I found myself wanting to understand it better, and a few days later, an opportunity presented itself in a way I hadn't expected. Nora and I had been assigned to the same equipment maintenance shift, a quiet, tedious duty that involved checking training gear for damage after each day's sparring sessions, and for the first time since our match, I found myself alone with her for an extended stretch of time. We worked in silence for a while, checking padding and joint supports until curiosity finally overcame my hesitation. "Can I ask you something?" I said. She didn't look up from the strap she was inspecting. "Go ahead." "What was it actually like?" I asked. "Growing up somewhere that taught you to fight like that?" She paused then, setting the strap down carefully before answering, and for the first time since I had known her, something in her posture softened slightly, not into weakness, but into something more thoughtful. "The colony I grew up on wasn't officially a Deathworld," she said. "Not on paper. It was classified as a challenging environment for agricultural development, which is a polite way of saying the local wildlife considered us part of the food chain rather than above it. We didn't have perimeter fences that actually kept anything out. We had training, starting young, and the training was simple. Every mistake you made in practice, you made once, and then you either learned from it or you didn't get a second chance to make it again in the field." I tried to imagine that kind of childhood and found I couldn't fully picture it, the way you can't really picture a color you've never seen, only approximate it using colors you already know. "There was a girl in my settlement," Nora continued, "a little older than me, who used to spar with the rest of us during training drills. She always held back, the way your friend Selk held back against you that first day, because she didn't want to hurt anyone in practice. She was kind, and everyone liked training with her because it never actually hurt." "What happened to her?" I asked, already suspecting the answer from the way Nora's voice had changed. "She went out on a supply run when she was 16, Nora said. "Something came out of the tree line that she had trained against 100 times in drills, and her body did exactly what her training had taught it to do. It held back. It hesitated for half a second, waiting for a match that was never going to call itself over the way practice always had. That half-second was the only difference between her and everyone else who came home that day. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything, and she didn't seem to need me to. "That's why I take the order seriously," she said finally, picking the strap back up and returning to her work as if the conversation had cost her something she needed to recover from immediately. "Not because I enjoy hurting people in training. I don't. But because I've seen what happens when training teaches your body to hesitate, and by the time you understand the mistake, there's no time left to correct it." I thought about Grath's complaint, and the murmuring agreement that had rippled through the hall in support of him, and I understood for the first time exactly how wide the gap was between what she had lived through and what the rest of us considered a difficult childhood. "Does the commander understand that?" I asked. "About where you're from," I told him. She said, "During my evaluation, before I even joined this unit. I think that's why he phrases the order the way he does. I think he's been waiting for someone to actually believe him." That thought stayed with me long after our shift ended, through dinner, through the quiet hours before sleep. Commander Solis had been repeating the same two words to every recruit who passed through his training hall for longer than any of us had served: "No mercy, no mercy, no mercy." And it had taken someone raised outside the comfort of core worlds and climate-controlled colonies to finally take him at his word. Over the following days, I watched something change gradually across the entire unit, subtle at first and then impossible to ignore. Recruits who had once approached sparring as a formality began training with genuine focus, checking their stances more carefully, committing to their strikes with actual intent rather than performing a version of combat designed to look competent without any real risk attached. Selk Norwin, who had submitted quickly against Nora weeks earlier, started arriving early to the training hall to practice defensive footwork on his own, determined not to be caught careless again. Even Petra Ashford, quick and clever but previously reliant on evasion alone, began working on techniques that would let her close distance decisively instead of just avoiding contact indefinitely. Grath Balmore took the longest to come around, understandably, given what his complaint had cost him in front of the entire unit. But even he began sparring differently after that assembly, with a wary respect that hadn't existed before, treating every match as something worth taking seriously rather than an opportunity to embarrass a smaller opponent. I found myself training harder too, not out of fear exactly, but out of a growing understanding that the softness I had carried with me from Meridian Station, the assumption that training and reality were separate categories with separate rules, might not serve me well if the day ever came when those categories collapsed into each other without warning. Commander Solis never officially acknowledged the shift happening across his unit, never gave a speech about lessons learned or growth observed, but I noticed him watching the training hall with something closer to approval than I had ever seen from him before, and more than once I caught his gaze settling on Nora Vance with an expression that looked almost like gratitude, quickly hidden behind his usual unreadable calm. None of us knew yet how soon we would need everything that shift had given us, or how close the day was when the difference between training and reality would stop being a distinction we could afford to take for granted. The emergency briefing call came through at 4 a.m, and I was on my feet and dressed before I was fully awake, which told me something about how much the last few weeks of training had already changed me. Around the barracks, other recruits were moving with the same urgency, boots hitting the floor, voices low and clipped instead of groggy. Iris caught up with me in the corridor, still fastening her jacket. "Do you know what this is about?" she asked. "I don't," I said, "but they don't wake up an entire unit at 4 a.m. for a drill." We reached the briefing room to find Commander Solis already standing at the front, along with 2 officers I didn't recognize wearing insignia from a different division entirely, one with an urgency stitched into their posture that drills never carried. The room filled quickly, and when Nora walked in, I noticed she looked exactly as alert as she always did, as if her body had never fully allowed itself to relax in the first place, waiting the entire time for a moment exactly like this one. "A supply convoy traveling through the Corvale corridor lost contact 8 hours ago," Solis said without any preamble. The last transmission indicated a hostile boarding in progress. This unit has been assigned to the recovery and response team. The room went very still. I felt my pulse pick up in a way that no sparring match had ever managed to produce. A cold, clear kind of fear that had nothing performative about it. "This is not a training exercise," Solis continued, his eyes moving slowly across the room, settling for half a second on each of us in turn. "I want to be completely clear about that, because I am aware that some of you have spent your entire service treating my orders as suggestions open to interpretation. That interpretation ends now. Whatever instincts you have built over the last several weeks, whatever seriousness you have finally begun bringing to your training, I need all of it today, or people who are counting on this response team will not survive the next several hours." I glanced sideways at Iris, and I could see the same realization crossing her face that was crossing mine. Every match we had fought since Nora joined the unit, every bruise, every moment of genuine fear, standing across from an opponent who refused to hold back, had been preparing us, whether we understood it at the time or not, for exactly this kind of morning. We boarded the transport 20 minutes later, and the flight out to the Corvale corridor felt longer than its actual duration, the kind of stretched, uneasy time that comes from sitting quietly with people you are about to depend on completely. I found myself seated across from Nora, who had her eyes closed, not sleeping, just still, the same stillness I had noticed the very first day I really looked at her, except now I understood it differently. It wasn't emptiness. It was readiness, a kind of conservation of energy that people who grow up needing every advantage learn to practice without even thinking about it. "You've done this before," I said quietly, not quite a question. "Not exactly this," she said, opening her eyes, "but something close to it, enough times that my body knows what to do without needing my permission first." "Does it help?" I asked, knowing that. "It helps that I'm not guessing anymore about what today requires," she said. "I used to have to guess, back home, whether a situation called for caution or commitment, and guessing wrong cost people I cared about. Here, at least, someone finally told me plainly what was expected, and I decided a long time ago that I would rather be the one person who believed him than one of the many who didn't, and found out too late that he meant it." I thought about Grath's complaint, and the assembly, and the way the entire unit's training had shifted in the weeks since, and I understood in that moment exactly how much all of that had actually been leading toward this exact morning, whether Commander Solis had planned it that way from the beginning, or simply recognized an opportunity when it presented itself. The transport set down at the edge of a debris field where the convoy had been ambushed, and as the doors opened, the difference between training and reality hit me immediately. Not through anything dramatic, but through the quality of the silence outside, heavier and more complete than any silence the training hall had ever produced. Commander Solis moved through the ranks quickly, assigning teams, and I found myself grouped with Iris, Selk, and Nora, moving toward the damaged convoy vessel, with weapons drawn, and every sense straining for movement that shouldn't be there. I want to describe what happened next carefully, because it mattered enormously to me afterward, the way it revealed everything the last several weeks had actually been building toward. We found the first crew member inside the second cargo hold, injured but alive, having barricaded himself behind a collapsed support strut after the initial breach. Selk moved to secure the area around him, and I noticed his movements were sharper than they had been weeks earlier, more decisive. The hesitation that had once made him submit quickly against Nora, replaced now with a controlled confidence that came from weeks of actually taking his training seriously. "Movement," Iris said suddenly, low and urgent, and I turned to see a shape emerging from the shadowed edge of the cargo hold, one of the boarders who had ambushed the convoy, clearly injured but still armed, still dangerous in the desperate way that cornered things become dangerous. Here is where the old version of me, the recruit who had arrived on this posting, believing that sparring and reality belonged to entirely separate categories, might have hesitated for half a second, waiting for some signal that the confrontation was really happening, some part of my training that still expected a call to end the match before anything irreversible occurred. I didn't hesitate, none of us did. Nora moved first, closing the distance before the boarder could fully raise his weapon, and I understood watching her that everything I had seen in the training hall, every match, every moment of controlled intensity, had been exactly this, scaled down to a size where nobody would actually get seriously hurt, but real in every other respect. She disarmed him with the same efficient economy of motion she had used against Grath weeks earlier, the same total commitment paired with exact restraint, using precisely the amount of force the situation required, and stopping the instant the threat was neutralized. Selk and Iris moved to secure him, and I stood there for a moment afterward, breathing hard, aware of how close that encounter had come to going differently, and how much of the difference had come down to instinct rather than conscious decision. Instinct that Nora had spent weeks helping to build in every recruit unfortunate enough to spar against her. "Clear," Nora called out, her voice steady, and we moved on to the next section of the convoy. The recovery operation took most of the day, and by the time it ended, the convoy's surviving crew had been secured, the boarders who remained had been contained, and our unit had come through without a single serious injury, a result that Commander Solis later described, in the closest thing to praise I ever heard him give, as significantly better than statistical expectation for a first live engagement. That evening, back at the compound, the mood among the recruits was different from anything I had experienced before, quiet and subdued rather than celebratory, the kind of quiet that comes from people who have just understood something about themselves that they didn't fully know before that morning. Grath found me near the equipment lockers, still favoring one arm slightly from a minor strain during the operation, and he didn't say anything for a long moment, just stood there like he was working up to something. "I owe Vance an apology," he said finally. "I think I owe the commander one too." I didn't say anything, just waited, sensing that he needed to say this without interruption. "I thought she was being cruel," he continued. "In training. I thought she was taking an order too literally just to make the rest of us look weak by comparison. Today I understood what she was actually doing. She wasn't trying to make anyone look weak. She was trying to make sure we survived a day exactly like today." He walked off before I could respond, and I found myself standing there, thinking about how much distance the entire unit had traveled since that first day when Nora Vance had stepped into a ring against him and ended a fight that everyone had expected her to lose within seconds. I found Commander Solis later that evening, standing alone near the edge of the compound, looking out at the same unfamiliar stars Iris and I had looked at weeks earlier, and something about his posture made me feel it was all right to approach him directly, something I wouldn't have attempted before that day. "Did you know?" I asked, without needing to specify what I meant. "I suspected," he said, without turning around. "I have given that order for as long as I have commanded recruits, and for as long as I have given it, almost nobody has ever actually followed it as stated." I began to wonder whether the fault was mine, whether the order itself was somehow unclear, until Recruit Vance arrived and proved that the order had never been the problem. "Why does it matter so much to you?" I asked. "The literal meaning of it." He turned then, and for the first time since I had known him, his expression held something unguarded, something that looked almost like old grief, carefully contained behind years of discipline. "Because I have watched soldiers die from hesitation that their training should have prevented," he said. "The kind of hesitation that comes from spending months or years practicing a version of combat gentler than the reality it is supposed to prepare you for. An order that isn't followed precisely is not really an order at all. It is a suggestion wearing an order's uniform, and suggestions get people killed just as easily as no training at all, sometimes more easily, because they create false confidence instead of honest uncertainty." I thought about Nora's story, the girl from her settlement who had hesitated for half a second against something she had trained against 100 times, and I understood that Commander Solis and Nora Vance had arrived at the exact same conclusion from very different directions. one through years of watching soldiers fail under pressure, and one through losing someone she cared about to a single moment of trained hesitation. "Is she all right?" I asked. "After today?" Solis considered the question for a moment. "She is the only recruit in this unit who did exactly what today required without needing to relearn anything first," he said. "I would say she is more than all right. I would say the rest of this unit finally caught up to where she has been standing all along." I walked back to the barracks that night, thinking about how strange it was that the thing which had made Nora Vance seem so unsettling during her first weeks in this unit, her total commitment to an order everyone else had treated as decoration, was the exact same quality that had likely saved every one of our lives during the recovery operation. It occurred to me that the gap between training and reality, the gap that had felt so comfortable and so safe when I first arrived at this posting, was actually the most dangerous thing any of us had been carrying, right up until someone finally forced us to close it. None of us knew yet that the Corvale recovery operation had only been the first sign of something larger building along the frontier, something that would test everything this unit had learned about the difference between practice and reality, and would ask each of us, one final time, exactly how seriously we had taken the order we had all been given so many times before. 3 months after the Corvale recovery, I found myself flat against a bulkhead with my heart slamming against my ribs while something heavy tore through metal on the other side of the wall, close enough that dust rained down from the ceiling with every impact. Our unit had been sent out to a mining station called Halveth Point after its automated defense grid went dark without warning, and what should have been a routine inspection had turned, within minutes of our arrival, into something none of the briefing reports had prepared us for. The station's lower levels had been breached by something the initial scans hadn't detected clearly, fast-moving and clearly hostile, and half our unit had been separated from the other half the moment the corridors started collapsing behind us. "Doyle, report." Commander Solis's voice crackled through my earpiece, tight with static, and something that might have been real concern. "Pinned down on level 6, I said, pressing my back harder against the bulkhead as another impact shook the corridor. "Calloway and Norwin are with me. We've lost visual on the rest of the team." "Vance is on her way to your position," he said. "Hold until she arrives." I looked over at Iris, crouched beside me with her weapon drawn, and at Selk on my other side, breathing hard but steady, his eyes fixed on the corridor ahead rather than darting around uselessly the way they might have months earlier. None of us said anything, because there wasn't anything useful left to say, only the waiting, stretched thin by the sound of something moving on the other side of a wall that suddenly felt much thinner than it had an hour ago. She arrived less than 90 seconds later, moving low and fast down the corridor from the direction we'd come, and I felt something in my chest loosen slightly just seeing her there, which surprised me, given how unsettling I had once found her total commitment to every order she was given. "Report," she said, dropping into position beside us. "Something breached containment on level 5, Iris said. "We don't have a clear visual, but it's fast, and it's already taken out 2 of the automated turrets protecting this section." Nora's eyes moved along the corridor, reading the damage pattern on the walls with the same careful attention she used to read an opponent's stance before a sparring match, and I understood, watching her, that this was exactly the kind of moment her entire life had prepared her for. The kind of moment where hesitation cost more than any wrong decision made quickly. "We need to fall back to the central junction," she said. "It's the only choke point on this level narrow enough to hold with the 4 of us. If we stay here, we're exposed on 2 sides." Solis's voice came through again. "Understood. Regroup at the central junction. Reinforcements are 12 minutes out." 12 minutes felt like an impossible distance in that moment, but there was no use dwelling on it, and Nora didn't waste time doing so. She moved us out in a tight formation, covering the corridor behind us as we retreated toward the junction, and I noticed that her movements carried the exact same quality I had first seen in the training hall months earlier. Total commitment paired with total control, no wasted motion, no hesitation, and absolutely no unnecessary risk taken for the sake of appearing brave. We reached the junction with maybe 2 minutes to prepare before the first sounds of pursuit reached us, something scraping along the corridor walls with a speed that made my mouth go dry. "Positions," Nora said, and without needing further instruction, Selk moved to cover the left approach, Iris took the right, and I found myself standing beside Nora at the center point, weapon raised, waiting. It came around the corner faster than I expected, a creature built low and powerful, clearly adapted for tight spaces, its plating catching the emergency lighting in a way that made it hard to track exactly where its body ended and the shadows began. My first shot went wide, adrenaline throwing off my aim in a way months of sparring hadn't fully trained out of me, and for one terrible half-second I felt the same old hesitation rising up, the instinct to step back, to wait for someone else to make the decisive move first. I didn't give in to it. I want to be honest about how close I came, because I think that honesty matters more than pretending I felt nothing but calm confidence. But I didn't step back, because some part of me, trained by every match I had fought against Nora, and every recruit who had fought against her since, understood clearly now that stepping back in a moment like this one didn't buy you safety. It only delayed the decision that needed making, and delay was exactly what got people killed. I fired again, correcting my aim, and this time the shot connected solidly enough to slow the creature's advance, buying Nora the half-second she needed to close the remaining distance and finish what my shot had started, moving with the same precise, economical force she had used in every match I had ever watched her fight, no more than the moment required, and not one fraction less. The corridor went quiet, except for our own ragged breathing. "Clear," Nora said, and I heard the tension drain slightly from her voice, though her eyes stayed sharp, scanning the corridor behind us for any further movement. Reinforcements arrived 6 minutes later to find our position secure, the creature contained, and all 4 of us standing rather than lying somewhere along that corridor, waiting for help that would have arrived too late. Commander Solis was among the first through the junction, and I watched something pass across his face when he saw us, relief so complete it briefly overwhelmed his usual careful control. "Report," he said, though his voice had lost its usual flatness. "Contained," Nora said simply. "No injuries on our side." Solis looked at each of us in turn, lingering longest on me, and I understood that he was doing the same silent accounting I was doing, comparing the recruit I had been on that first day of sparring against Selk, careful and controlled and completely unwilling to take a real risk, against the person standing in that corridor who had held his position and corrected his aim under actual fire rather than stepping back to let someone braver handle it. "Good work," he said, which from Commander Solis was closer to an outright declaration of pride than I had ever heard him offer anyone. The rest of the operation at Halveth Point took another several hours to complete, securing the remaining sections of the station and confirming there were no further breaches. But nothing that followed carried the same sharp edge as those minutes in the corridor, and by the time our unit boarded the transport back to the compound, exhaustion had replaced fear in every face around me, the particular exhaustion that comes after your body finally allows itself to stop bracing for impact. I sat beside Nora on the flight back, both of us quiet for a long while before I finally found the words I had been turning over since the corridor. "Thank you," I said, "for training us the way you did. I don't think I would have held that position without everything you put us through these last few months." She considered that for a moment, before answering, and when she did, there was something in her voice I hadn't heard before, something that sounded almost like relief of her own. "I wasn't sure it would work," she admitted. "Teaching people who grew up somewhere safe to actually believe an order like that. I was worried it would just make everyone resent me without actually changing anything that mattered." "It changed everything that mattered," I said. "I think most of us just needed proof that the danger was real before we could take the warning seriously." "That's true where I grew up too," she said quietly. "Nobody believes an order like that until they've seen what happens to the people who didn't follow it. I just wish it hadn't taken watching someone die to teach me the lesson myself." I didn't have anything to offer in response to that, so I simply sat with her in silence for the remainder of the flight, and somewhere in that silence, I found myself thinking back over everything that had happened since the day her name was first called to the sparring ring, the shock of watching her defeat Grath so completely, the fear of facing her myself, the assembly where she had stood alone against an entire hall of recruits who didn't yet understand what she was trying to teach them, and finally, the corridor at Halveth Point, where every lesson she had taught us in that training hall had proven itself worth every bruise it had cost along the way. Commander Solis found me alone in the equipment bay the following morning, checking gear that didn't strictly need checking, mostly using the task as an excuse to sit with my own thoughts a little longer before the next day's schedule began. "You did well yesterday," he said, standing in the doorway with his arms folded in the familiar posture I had grown used to over these last several months. "I almost didn't," I admitted. I hesitated, just for a second, before I corrected my aim. "A second corrected is worth infinitely more than a second lost to indecision entirely," he said. "That is the entire purpose of training someone properly. Not to remove fear, which cannot be removed, but to make sure the fear doesn't win the argument against what needs doing." I thought about Nora's story again, the girl from her settlement who had lost that argument by half a second, and I understood finally, standing there in the quiet equipment bay, exactly what Commander Solis had been trying to build in this unit from the very first day he issued that order to a room full of recruits who had no idea yet how literally he meant it. "Will you keep giving that order?" I asked. "No mercy. Every single day," he said. "For as long as I command recruits who need reminding that training exists to prepare them for something real, not to protect them from ever having to feel uncomfortable. Most recruits will always try to guess at some gentler meaning hiding behind the words. It only takes one who refuses to guess to teach an entire unit what the words actually mean." He left the equipment bay a moment later, and I sat there a while longer, turning his words over in my mind, thinking about the strange path that had led one quiet human woman from a colony world nobody had heard of to become the single reason an entire unit of recruits from a dozen different species survived their first real encounter with danger. I think about that first day often, even now, long after I left that posting for other assignments across the frontier. I think about how ordinary the order had sounded when Commander Solis first said it. No mercy. The kind of phrase every soldier hears so often it stops meaning anything at all. I think about how easily an entire hall of recruits, myself included, had decided without ever discussing it that the order was simply decoration, a formality dressed up as instruction, safe to ignore because everyone else was ignoring it too. And I think about Nora Vance, sitting perfectly still among all of us that first day, hearing the exact same words the rest of us heard, and deciding, for reasons shaped by a childhood none of us could fully imagine, that an order was an order, and that the kindest thing she could do for the people around her was to take it exactly as seriously as it was meant to be taken, even when that seriousness made her feared and misunderstood before it finally made her trusted. I understand now why the rumors about Deathworlders always carried that particular mixture of awe and unease, the sense that people who survived environments harsh enough to earn that label carried something within them that the rest of us, raised somewhere gentler, simply didn't possess. It isn't cruelty, whatever Grath believed that first week. It isn't even toughness alone, though there was plenty of that too. It's honesty. The specific and uncomfortable honesty of someone who has learned, at real cost, exactly where the line sits between practice and consequence, and who refuses to pretend that line doesn't exist just because pretending would be easier for everyone around her. Commander Solis still gives that order every single day, to every new recruit who joins his unit, and I imagine most of them still hear it the way I once did, as a phrase rather than an instruction. But somewhere in that training hall, if the story gets told the way it should, there will always be at least one recruit who listens a little more carefully than the rest, who wonders whether the words might actually mean exactly what they say, and who decides, the way Nora Vance once decided, that the safest thing anyone can do in training is to take the order completely, honestly, and without a single moment of hesitation, seriously.